Autumn 2009 feels like the hinge of a door I did not know I had been standing beside. I remember the exact day my mailbox yielded the first thin packet of testimony. October, a month already smelling of cold leaf and the particular fatigue that settles after a long summer of doing more than you were trained to do. The packet did not look like anything important. Photocopied pages rolled at the edges, a few dates, a handful of signatures or initials, and lines of text typed in hurried fonts. But those small sheets began to open a ledger of memory that would unfold over the next decade. The story, as it unfolded in those first months, was quiet. There was no dramatic flourish of scandal on the front pages. The opening was patient and domestic. In hospital corridors between shifts, in the half-light of wards, people began to speak. I learned of those first words in late 2009 and into 2010 through interviews convened by a small local inquiry. The inquiry had not been called to indict a single person. Its purpose, at least in its initial framing, was more modest and more searching, to understand a pattern, an accumulation of errors that, when taken apart and examined, looked less like malice than like the sedimentation of everyday choices. Nurse testimonies from autumn 2009 were often the most immediate. They described crowded bays where bassinets sat edge to edge as if someone had lined them up by habit and not by safety. Mothers whose sleep had been carved to shreds, who held their infants like contraband, corridors bright with monitors and the smell of antiseptic, dimmed by a culture that did not prioritize the paperwork that would ensure a child's future. I remember a nurse telling the inquiry, voice thin with professional exhaustion, that sometimes a lullaby was the only thing that separated one exhausted mother from the next. The phrase was not melodramatic, it was precise, a shorthand for a kind of triage of comfort, decisions made to preserve warmth and dignity in the present while the future was deferred. Junior doctors contributed another kind of account. Nights when a resident trained for a few years but not yet trained for everything had to make instantaneous choices. Paperwork, these doctors said, became an afterthought when a newborn's oxygen saturation fell or a mother hemorrhaged. I still hear the practical cadence of one junior doctor who described nights when we had to choose hands before handwriting. Those phrases sit in the inquiry minutes dated from late 2009 through 2010. The minutes read like the transcript of a hospital sleeping and waking simultaneously. Midwives who bridged the clinical and the intimate offered stories that blurred procedural detail and human tenderness. How a newborn might be cradled and unlabeled while staff sought a parent. How a name might be delayed, not by design but by a lack of time and the press of other needs. These early testimonies arrived like fragments of a mosaic. A photocopy in an envelope slipped into an unstaffed drawer. A typed note lost in the margins of a patient's chart. We were out of name bands, no certified copy issued at discharge, photocopy in envelope. Such phrases recur across the minutes and form a catalogue of the ordinary failures that, repeated, became extraordinary. No single villain leaps from these pages. Instead, a culture emerges, a braided set of small compromises and expedient choices that, night after night and year after year, allowed a child's legal identity to dangle on the edge of a photocopied sheet. Understanding that culture demanded a change in angle. The inquiry showed, to those who followed its progress, that the issue was not merely administrative laziness. It was the logic of institutions functioning under pressure. A manager, in good faith, might authorize months of overtime to cover a staffing gap, thinking the temporary solution would bridge a crisis. A midwife, trained to prioritize comfort for a mother and newborn in a moment of acute vulnerability, might defer the bureaucratic task of certified copies. Individually, these are defensible choices. Accumulated, they produce a moral economy in which record-keeping slides from duty to optional task. The push and pull between compassion in the present and fidelity to records is the theme that repeats through the inquiry minutes and the subsequent debates that occupied administrators and community activists for years. At home, life went on in ways both distracting and sustaining. From winter 2009 into the spring of 2010, my child grew in visible stages of small wonder. I remember December 2009. Snow on the pavement and tiny hands learning to tie shoelaces with the fierce concentration of someone teaching themselves a ritual that matters. The child, so ordinary in every domestic way, could sit for whole afternoons with books about ships, which in their imagination were always just a harbor away from adventure. Laughter, my partner's stubborn jawline and Rose's trilled R's, blurred into something inevitable and beloved. My partner, once the logistical heart of our household, became in those years a co-equal in the project of endurance. He learned to read bus schedules and compose conciliatory emails to teachers with the same tenderness he used to pack lunchboxes. We carved domestic contracts, practical treaties, who handled morning drop-offs, who wrote letters to school, who would stand at a lectern when a complex story needed distilling into 3 sober minutes. These bargains were acts of affection as much as methods of staying sane. The envelope arrived into our life not as a headline but as a quiet intrusion. The kitchen table moment, March 2011, remains painfully ordinary, and perhaps for that reason consequential. It was a weekday evening. Homework lay half done. The radio hummed news to which I could not muster attention. I handed the photocopy to my child as one might pass an old photograph. "This is a story about why paperwork matters," I said in a voice that felt instructive and protective at once. They turned the page, felt the paper's texture, and shrugged in the disarming way children refuse to carry adult grief. That shrug, I would later learn to interpret as resilience rather than indifference. Still, in the small moment when the room went quiet and the page lay between us, the envelope felt like an accused object, an unassuming scrap that had the power to mute conversations and redraw edges. Between 2011 and 2014, the child's questions sharpened. In 2014 they asked, in the blunt way young people are wont to ask, whether this changed how they should think of their family, whether friends would judge them, whether the thing hidden in a drawer implied a different past. My answers evolved into practical choices rather than pronouncements. "We chose one another," I told them. "This fact complicates the texture of that choice but does not unmake it." The language, choice, not condemnation, settled between us like a small net, securing a fragile truth and offering a way to carry forward. The question of identity did not exist in private alone. A cultural tide arrived alongside our conversations. By 2015, consumer DNA testing had become a familiar phenomenon. Advertisements on television, programs that celebrated long-lost cousins, blogs canonizing the thrill of discovery. At first I resisted. The idea of depositing our family's genetic threads into a public database felt like exposing seams that should remain private. Yet by 2015, the practicalities of adolescence, aging bodies of certainty that demand small, urgent answers, made the option harder to refuse. My child, entering their teens, began to bargain with uncertainty. On an autumn evening in 2016, with tea steaming and a small world map spread on the table like a set of invitations, we agreed to take the test together. It felt less like a search for absolution than a precaution, another lock on an old gate. When the results returned in winter 2016, they carried both the comfort of the expected and the shock of the uncanny. There were genetic clusters pointing to families in towns we had never visited, small cartographies of migration we could only imagine. More jarringly, the tests flagged a close match to a half-sibling whose markers overlapped enough to demand attention. We reached out in the cautious idiom of strangers who might become family, an introduction, a list of questions about everyday life, and a careful negotiation about boundaries. The early messages were transactional, names, ages, photos of dogs and kitchens. But over weeks they acquired humor, irritation, and the ordinary detail that transforms strangers into acquaintances. There was no cinematic reconciliation scene, no sudden recognition and embrace. Instead there were tentative conversations, awkward courtesies, and the slow work of learning how to hold a newly discovered relationship without forcing it to become something else. That half-sibling became another hinge in a story already full of hinges. In spring 2017 we met for a birthday lunch at a cafe where mismatched chairs and a leaning chalkboard felt as if the room were apologizing to itself for its imperfections. We spoke of recipes and television shows, of the absurdity of dating apps and the anxious care of owning a stubborn houseplant. The envelope and its photocopy were mentioned briefly. To them the object was family lore, an interesting curio that opened a small window. For me it remained a reminder that truth can be partial and still generous. We did not resolve questions of parentage. We exchanged photographs and recipes and made a mutual, rueful agreement to stay in touch. The meeting held hope because it was ordinary, two people across a small round table, building a relationship by trading small bits of life. Institutional change moved at a different pace, sometimes microscopic, occasionally sweeping, but always iterative. The early 2010s were years when many hospitals began the slow transition from ledgers and loose paper to electronic records. Integration lagged and budgets constrained what could be implemented and when. In local hospitals across our county, digitization happened in fits and starts between 2010 and 2015. Policies began to shift incrementally. Some institutions adopted mandates requiring parents to be given certified copies of birth-related forms at discharge. Other hospitals experimented with copying procedures or placed photocopiers within wards. In late 2011, a local ethics committee convened to study informal notations and the workplace cultures that allowed them to persist. Their meetings, documented in minutes spanning 2011 to 2013, are a small chronicle of how urgency and institutional caution collide. Earnest testimony about human consequence alternated with procedural concerns about budgets and legal exposure. Not every proposal was enacted. Budgets were tight, IT systems proved stubborn to integrate, administrators preferred nudging to radical overhaul. Change was, as those minutes show, a sequence of small, cumulative steps. Between 2011 and 2014, the public record, the published minutes, the memos, the op-eds, began to accumulate into a narrative that was more than anecdote. It became, for those who worked in public health administration, a cautionary file. In auditoriums and staff rooms, I would sometimes read aloud fragments from those early minutes. Photocopy in envelope, no certified copy issued at discharge, we were out of name bands. Hearing those phrases in a room of people who had lived similar nights produced a particular response: recognition, a flush of shame, and then, in the best cases, a desire to act. The archival atmosphere of those minutes, paper after paper dated signed, pressed us to treat small acts as traceable, and therefore reparable. The reforms that followed were modest but meaningful. Over the next 5 years, incremental measures compiled into real change. Hospitals introduced a standardized checklist for birth documentation in 2014. A simple sheet with boxes to tick for identity verification, certified copies issued, next of kin recorded, photocopy handed to parent, archive logged. The checklist's elegance lay in simplicity: teachable, enforceable, cheap. It traveled with a newborn like a small passport. Other measures followed: mandates in some facilities to photocopy key forms and hand those photocopies to parents at discharge, training modules for staff that emphasized the moral weight of record integrity alongside clinical concerns. Where these reforms were embraced, they felt trivial to the people who filled them out but enormous to families who, years later, could finally anchor a child's legal identity to named facts. My own public work began in 2012. I started speaking in staff rooms and auditoriums, at community colleges and neighborhood centers, and at conferences. I did not become a theatrical orator overnight. My approach was steady and ordinary: tell the story of the envelope not as a scandal to graze the public appetite but as a cautionary lesson about what everyday honesty looks like in institutions. I wrote essays that first appeared in a local magazine in 2013 and were republished by a regional journal in 2015. In those pieces, I wrote about paperwork as a form of care as often as an instrument of bureaucracy. Letters arrived in response. Between 2013 and 2017, a steady trickle of messages, some pleas, some accounts of relief. People reached out clutching their own slips of paper. Those messages asked for help navigating records offices and for advice on freedom of information requests. They asked for aid in locating lost certificates. I tried to answer as many as I could, guiding people through the labyrinth of records departments and pointing them toward legal aid where necessary. The letters I received, simple notes of gratitude, became a sustaining force. Tenderness threaded through this public work in small, sustaining ways. Rosa, present from the first nights, her trilled R's threaded through our private stories, evolved into someone whose visits were salvations. From 2010 onward, she arrived with dishes that smelled of cumin and patience, sat for hours with hands folded, and asked about the minutiae that keep families intimate. Children gathered in her lap at parties and demanded stories about when Rosa was a girl. She told those stories with color, which made mundane pasts feel epic. As she became part of our circle, it became easier to say aloud that she was family. When my father died in 2018, a loss that reopened fissures I had thought sealed, Rosa stood by us at the graveside. There was grief and, oddly, relief. relief that the ground beneath us did not require a tidy narrative to hold our sorrow. It is important to say here, slowly and plainly, that the photocopy itself matured from an object of private alarm into a public artifact. By 2014, I had moved it from a leather journal into a small archival sleeve at the community center, an act as practical as symbolic. The slip of paper, once a private scrap, now belonged to more people than my drawer. It became a shared artifact in a story about institutional failure and the ordinary insistence on better practices. I would sometimes lay it on a table for visitors. People gathered around and, for a few minutes, the room would become still. The paper did not accuse, it asked to be seen. Those moments were intimate public rituals, congregations of attention around a humble object. My child, as they grew into late adolescence and young adulthood, made choices about what parts of the story to carry. Sometimes they asked to hold the photocopy, turning it over with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. At other times they preferred the concrete comforts of being young, packed lunches, rides to a friend's house, jokes that made everyone laugh. I learned to respect both inclinations. Knowledge need not be linear, it can branch and be forgiving. More important than what we know is the company we keep when we discover it. The image of the Easter table, where the envelope first silenced the room, became a recurring frame for thinking about attention. I return to that scene often. I imagine the envelope among folded napkins, interrupting the convivial exchange of recipes and the slow weathering of family jokes. At Easter, dates shifting from year to year but always a public marker in the calendar. The table is both festival and ritual, plates passed, the obligatory argument about who overcooked the ham, small children asking for an extra egg. Into that domestic choreography, the envelope intruded. Its arrival there was never cinematic, instead it had the more precise and cruel effect of lowering sound. Conversations that had been easy fell away. The object sat between family members like a small instruction, attend now. That instruction often landed with different weight on different shoulders. Some people heard it and steadied, others heard it and turned away. The table, where we rehearsed belonging and sometimes named it, became a testing ground for how charity toward the present sits beside the duty to the future. On late evenings, sometimes in 2016, sometimes as late as 2019, my thoughts returned to that Easter table and to the women who opened drawers and found slips of paper, to children who grew up asking questions adults had suppressed. There is no perfect ending in those imaginations. There are people who will never agree with the choices we made, legal systems that remain maddeningly slow, and administrators who prefer incrementalism to radical change. Some nights resentment wakes sharp and cold. Other afternoons gratitude spills warm like sunlight through the kitchen window. The tension endures. It must be tended through daily acts of presence. That presence was practical. It meant showing up to meetings, replying to scared messages, keeping copies of forms where they could be found, and making time to sit with a distraught parent who had spent months chasing paperwork. It meant sitting with midwives who feared retribution for speaking out and offering them anonymized ways to contribute to policy reviews. From the accumulation of these modest acts emerged a network of informal support, an email chain offering advice on records requests, volunteers to help older residents scan and digitize boxes of certificates, and a small legal clinic providing pro bono assistance to families for whom a missing paper had become an insurmountable barrier to education or citizenship. In the community center, where the photocopy lived, the archival sleeve gathered more than dust. People came for reasons both mundane and urgent: an elderly woman hunting her son's birth certificate to apply for a pension, a social worker tracing a child's medical history for a school, a student writing a paper on institutional accountability. Each person who touched the slip left an imprint on the accumulated attention it carried. In 2016, a legal clinic photographed the photocopy for a training module to show new staff how a single oversight could reverberate across decades. We consented. The module was completed in 2017 and used in training sessions across the county. To see procedural change translate into a parent's ability to produce a form felt like a quiet bureaucratic revolution. Not every story was triumph. Difficult conversations continued at family gatherings. Relatives sometimes skirted around the past as if avoiding a pothole on a favorite road. Resentments resurfaced at odd moments, sometimes with the bluntness of a thrown stone. I learned to hold those moments without letting them become the whole story. We continued to choose one another in the small, sustaining ways that matter, attending recitals, delivering soup to the ill, folding the photocopy into an envelope and placing it among hospital papers so that the next person might find it. Those small acts of care accumulated and became the texture of a life. Strangers, too, made the lessons of the photocopy palpable. Emails arrived from people who had read an essay and then, clutching their own photocopy, gone into a records office and asked for a certified form. Some of those searches led to reconciliation. Other attempts ran up against laws and procedures that had not yet caught up with compassion. All the messages reminded me that documentation is never merely administrative, it is moral. The photocopy teaches us to ask for proof not as accusation but as protection, an effort to keep children from inheriting the sharp edges of secrets. As the work continued, patterns revealed themselves. Gaps in records were often not motivated by malice but by the rhythm of time-pressured decisions and workplace cultures that normalized slippage. A nurse's margin note, "baby unlabeled," written in hurried shorthand could become illegible weeks later. A photocopy, made on a staff member's initiative, might never be countersigned. The outcome remained the same: someone seeking identity found emptiness. Exposing these patterns required listening to those often labeled peripheral, administrators who knew the constraints of IT budgets, night shift staff whose whispered stories held the truth of busier hours, clerical workers who had long fought for better filing cabinets. Reform had to happen at each of these levels, and it demanded patience and acceptance of partial victories. One such victory, modest yet transformative in practice, came in 2014 with the creation of the standard checklist to accompany every birth. The checklist was an unglamorous sheet with a handful of boxes: identity verification, certified copy issued, next of kin recorded, photocopy handed to parent, archive logged. It could be taught quickly to new staff and mandated without expensive technology. When the checklist was first introduced, it met the usual bureaucratic sighs and a few grumbles about added paperwork. But on a hectic night, when a stressed resident used it and handed a young mother a packet of documents, its value became undeniable. For that family, the packet was not merely paper, it was insurance against an uncertain future. The public work I had taken up translated into practical supports. Volunteers formed to walk families through records requests. In 2016, a small nonprofit emerged from loose networks of people who had reached out: volunteers for searches, templates for freedom of information requests, and a referral list for legal clinics. Hospitals that once bristled at criticism discovered that change could be implemented without wrecking budgets. A photocopier in the maternity ward, a digital backup routine, training for night teams. What had once seemed intractable became a series of adjustments institutions could adopt without fanfare. The path forward was not smooth. Administrators retired before reforms were fully sealed, budgets shrank, new IT systems introduced unanticipated problems, fields that refused certain characters, or a lack of integration that meant births logged in one system did not appear in another. In 2015, a digitization effort in a local hospital lost cached images, forcing staff to redocument births from memory. Each setback underscored the fragility of success and the necessity of continuity. The community work, public testimony, families demanding better practices, kept reforms alive on the agenda. The stakes remained sharply personal. Letters arrived from parents who had used templates and checklists to secure long-needed documents. There were victories: children finally able to register for school or travel without the shadow of missing proof, and there were messier outcomes: parents rebuffed by law, statutes unsuited to complicated human lives. When the law failed, the work shifted from advocacy to accompaniment. Finding a lawyer, filling out forms, sitting in corridors as witness to someone's persistence. The photocopy at the community center, over time, became emblematic. Students used it in sociology papers, social workers used it to show how a small oversight could compound into a lifelong barrier. An elderly woman once came with a shoebox of papers and sat down to tell a story of a birth she had assisted decades earlier, how she had tucked a certified copy into a drawer with the belief it might be needed. Layered stories accumulated like sediment. The photocopy became a node in a web of lived experience, a modest shrine to attention. The half-sibling relationship developed slowly, like any relationship that survives through small, habitual acts. We exchanged photographs and told stories of awkward school plays, childhood illnesses, and neighborhood habits. There were long silences on phone calls and sudden laughter when a shared joke landed. We learned how to be present without dictating the terms of belonging. In late summer 2018, our children went to a small fair and rode a Ferris wheel. Afterwards, we sat on a bench eating cotton candy and compared palate preferences. Those ordinary moments mattered because they were sustained and repeatable. The half-sibling became someone who could be counted on to bring a pie or offer counsel about a leaking tap. That presence reminded me that family is not only given, it is built through shared quotidian actions. Rose's aging altered the rhythms of our household. She lingered some afternoons, telling stories about an uncle who had been a shoemaker, a summer she learned to string a hammock, or how it felt to be overlooked by the state. Those afternoons became slow accumulations of education. When her health declined in 2019 and 2020, we rallied the network we had built. Friends who had once helped with photocopying offered to take her to appointments. The community center became a hub for coordinating meals and transportation. Political work and personal life intertwined. The people who learned to ask for paperwork also learned to deliver casseroles. Small rituals gained weight. In 2020, when my child, now 19, called from an airport gate, they laughed about watching families argue over a name on a ticket. They thought, with bemused protectiveness, of our photocopy. On a bench in a passport office in 2021, the slip's presence in a wallet produced a stranger's remark, "It's ritual, isn't it?" For a moment we were connected across a small recognition that tending records is a way of affirming human dignity. Educational and institutional uses of the photocopy expanded. Workshops used it to teach volunteers how to assist with records requests. The legal training module that featured its image in 2017 evolved into a fuller curriculum used in hospital orientations by 2018 and spread regionally by 2020. Clerical teams, once resistant, discovered that simple, clear practices could make meaningful improvements without disrupting care. The changes were not spectacular in headlines, but they altered outcomes. Families no longer left wards empty-handed but with packets and a sense their child's future need not hinge on fragile memory. People continued to write with both triumph and despair. Messages arrived of passports acquired, of school admissions secured, and of families finally able to travel without fear. Others told more sorrowful tales. Offices destroyed by fire, records lost, and statutory hurdles that felt designed for straight-line lives. Every message reminded me that the work is ongoing and cannot be completed in a single legislative session or committee meeting. If the story has been a relay, it is because progress required many hands. One person starts a policy conversation, another shepherds it through committees, a volunteer helps with a record search, a midwife implements a checklist on a busy night. That chain of shared labor made change tangible. Transformation rarely arrives from a single heroic act, it comes from repeated, ordinary gestures. As the 2010s gave way to the early 2020s, the pieces of our life, Rose's visits, my child's maturation, the community center archive, half-sibling lunches, training modules, legal clinics, checklists, formed a continuous thread. The narrative is not tidy, never finished, and always partial, but it is a story of ordinary attention. If there is a single lesson from the accumulation of years, it is this: truth is rarely a single event. It is a series of choices repeated over time, the quiet habits we build to make each other's lives legible. The photocopy that once silenced a room now sits in a sleeve, and when people come to see it they see not only paper but traces of work, calls made, forms filed, conversations held, meals shared, checklists ticked. At times of deepest fatigue, I imagine the legacy I hope to leave. I do not imagine a monument in stone. I imagine a habit, asking for certified copies, filing them in labeled drawers, teaching children to ask questions without shame. I imagine a future parent placing a certified copy into a packet and slipping a note inside that simply reads, "This is to keep you safe." Paperwork practiced as an act of care, that modest legacy is what I hope for. On quiet evenings I still see the envelope at the Easter table. It no longer feels like a raw wound but like a direction: attend to details, tell the truth when it is hard, practice honesty every day. Ordinary objects, an envelope, a photocopy, a certificate, can call forth extraordinary acts of care when we choose to treat them that way. The slip of paper that once muted a room now helps open them. It is a reminder that being someone's daughter, partner, or friend does not require a flawless lineage, it requires honesty. Honesty, when practiced, allows a secret to become a story we can bear together. In the years after the photocopy moved to the community archive, small ordinary acts accumulated into a steadiness that felt like healing. My child carried the slip sometimes in a wallet, sometimes tucked into a book, sometimes forgotten for months. Once, in a long line at a passport office in 2021, they pulled it out to check a detail. A stranger looked over and remarked on the ritual quality of preserving such things. For a moment we were joined in recognition that small acts of record-keeping are ways of affirming human dignity. The archive at the community center continued to draw people. A student used the paper for a sociology project in 2019. Social workers visited to establish medical histories for school registration. Trainers from a county legal clinic photographed the photocopy for a module on record-keeping, and the image shown in training rooms prompted staff to think where their forms might end up once a shift ended. Hospitals that used the module often confessed that seeing the paper and hearing the story made them consider those practical outcomes. Not every evening ended in satisfaction. Resentment would return on some nights, and I would replay the moment the envelope sat on the kitchen table, wishing there had been a single person to blame. But the more I reflected, the more convinced I became that blaming an individual missed the point. The problem was systemic. No single scapegoat could account for the architecture of neglect. What was required was steadier accountability, administrators transparent about failures, legislators thoughtful about the implications of lax rules, staff trained to treat paperwork as moral work. The scope of that task is humbling, but it makes small changes feel necessary and righteous. If I imagine an end, if such certainty is allowable, I hope what I leave is not merely records of battles won or policies changed, but a culture of small kindnesses in bureaucratic spaces. I hope people remember to ask for certified copies, to file them in labeled drawers, and to teach their children why those pieces of paper matter. I hope that when my child, someday a parent, places a certified copy into a packet, they will feel that gesture as a kind of love. It is a modest legacy, but it preserves a conviction. Handled with care and honesty, ordinary paperwork can protect a life. This conviction has guided me through sleepless nights and into mornings, through archival sleeves and community meetings, and it continues to shape how I answer emails and sit at kitchen tables. The envelope, once a shadow, has become a small beacon. It asks us to pay attention, to keep records, to practice honesty, and to understand that in the daily repetition of these habits we remake families in ways gentler and truer than secrecy ever allows. And so the work goes on. Committees will meet and reconfigure, checklists will be revised and adopted in new places, IT systems will be upgraded and, inevitably, glitch. People will continue to bring shoeboxes of papers to the community center. Half-siblings will find one another and slowly determine whether and how to be family. Rosa will tell more stories until she cannot, and then others will tell them for her. My child will become a parent or not. Regardless, they will carry the photocopy sometimes as a talisman and sometimes as a practical paper. The photocopy sits in a sleeve now waiting, not as an accusation but as an invitation, to attend, to speak, to certify, and to show up. In the small, ordinary acts of such attention is the work of making tomorrow more bearable for those who will inherit our imperfect but increasingly honest institutions. The envelope that silenced the Easter table remained an indexical object in the years that followed, less a drama than a hinge. After that particular meal I took to carrying myself differently through public and private spaces, aware that the smallest material objects, an envelope, a photocopy, could rearrange social relations just as effectively as a verdict or a confession. From 2017 through 2021 the photocopy had moved from a private talisman to a public teaching tool. From 2022 forward it settled, in my life and in the life of our community, into a new phase of sedimentation and institutional memory. The pandemic years of 2020 and 2021 complicated everything. The community center that housed the archive shuttered for months in spring of 2020, its doors locked under emergency orders that echoed, at a bureaucratic level, the same neglect that had once made that photocopy necessary. Volunteers who had shepherded boxes of papers suddenly re-evaluated risk. Training modules developed in 2017 and expanded by 2018 were shifted to digital formats. By late 2020, the legal clinic that had used the image in a classroom adapted the module for remote learning. In January 2021, the county health system invited our community organizers to consult on safe, remote intake procedures for births and registrations. The focus was less on heroics than continuity. How do you prevent the erasure of a child's identity when families cannot gather, when offices are understaffed, when a small omission becomes an intractable barrier? Those conversations bore fruit in incremental but durable ways. In March 2021, a pilot program launched at 2 hospitals in the region, a checklist for discharge clerks that included the routine offer of certified copies and the mandatory recording of whether a family had received documentation. The checklists were simple, 3 items long, printed on pale blue paper and laminated behind a counter. Easy to ignore, easy to forget. Yet even such small formalities mattered. In June, a nurse in one of the pilot hospitals told me that the checklist had caught a lapse. A new mother whose paperwork was incomplete was prompted to speak with a registrar before leaving, and the registrar discovered a clerical error that would otherwise have taken months and an appeal to correct. As the pilot expanded, the community archive played a role that was both practical and emblematic. Staff at the center digitized selected training materials and the image of the photocopy for internal use. Workshops in the summer of 2021 taught volunteers how to guide families through virtual records requests. That year, a sociology student who had used the paper for a 2019 project returned to conduct interviews for a dissertation on how small rituals become public policy. Her oral histories described a chain of minor acts: an envelope placed carefully on a table, a photocopy made in a supermarket vestibule, a brisk call to a county office, that, aggregated, altered institutional behavior. Those interviews entered the archive. They were filed alongside training modules, the laminated checklist, and the photocopy in its sleeved pocket, a palimpsest of lived attention. The half-sibling relationship deepened in ways predictable and not. In late summer of 2018, our children had ridden a Ferris wheel and compared cotton candy flavors. In 2022, the half-sibling accompanied my child to a university open day. Such ordinary overlaps erode the extraordinary status of origin stories. They make living together, in some respects, unremarkable. By autumn 2022, both households shared a calendar: who would pick up whom from a late shift, whose cat would be fed while someone was away, and those small acts of mutual aid reinforced a broader cultural shift: family as practice rather than proof. Policy work, meanwhile, moved forward in fits and starts. In 2021 and 2022, committees convened at the county and municipal levels to grapple with the structural causes behind what had happened at our Easter table. Advocates argued for statutory presumptions that would make access to certified copies automatic in certain contexts. Hospital administrators and legal counsel worried about costs, about fraud, about the specter of litigated privacy. The debate was not new. Governance always measures risk against dignity, but this time it was anchored to a tangible object, to a narrative that people could see and touch. In August 2022, the county board adopted a resolution requiring hospitals receiving public funds to adopt the laminated checklist and to document compliance quarterly. The resolution stopped short of guaranteeing free certified copies in every case, but it created an accountability mechanism where previously there had been none. That same year, the community center mounted a small, quiet exhibition: Paper and Presence. It was not a gallery show in any grand sense. It occupied a corner of the center, comprised mainly of photographs, copies of training modules, and the sleeved photocopy displayed under glass with permission. People came in dribs and drabs: students, health workers, a lawyer who had once been a midwife. Some cried, others took notes. The purpose of the exhibition was not aesthetic. It was pedagogical and political, to make visible the bureaucratic thinness upon which so many lives depend. It included a timeline: 2017, when the training module was first photographed; 2018, when it entered hospital orientations; 2019, the student project; 2020, pandemic adjustments; 2021, the pilot checklists; 2022, the county resolution. Visitors read the dates and understood, with the small cold thrill of arithmetic, that change requires not only passion but accumulated practice. Rosa's story threaded through all of this. Her health, which had declined intermittently in 2019 and 2020, became more fragile after 2021. She still came for long afternoons sometimes, telling stories about the shoemaker uncle, about the hammock, about being overlooked, and those visits accrued like leaves. In late 2023, Rosa fell ill in a way that demanded decisions. The network that had built itself around her moved into action. Volunteers coordinated meals and rides, the community center helped with paperwork, friends recorded oral histories of her stories. Her decline was not sudden so much as a gradual softening of presence. The stories she could tell shortened, the days she lingered grew fewer. In early 2024, she died at home with the neighbor who had once made photocopies and a nurse from the community center sitting by the window. There was no grand public ritual. The memorials were domestic and local, a folded program for a small service, a potluck at the center, a playlist of songs she loved. We read her favorite anecdotes aloud, the shoemaker's hammer on rainy days, the hammock strung between two trees, the way she once refused to be overlooked. Her absence created a new kind of labor. Others told her stories for her, as I had anticipated. A friend collected recipes and the neighbor organized a booklet of memories. The community center archived these items alongside the photocopy and the training materials. They were cross-referenced by date and circumstance. In June 2024, a legal clinic used Rosa's oral history packet in a staff workshop to emphasize why records matter to narratives of belonging. The packet was not the same thing as the photocopy, but in the archive it occupied a neighboring folder. Together those pages created a fuller picture, one of personal histories entangled with bureaucratic forms. Within this period my child, who had been 19 in 2020 and had pulled the slip from a wallet at a passport gate that same year, made adult choices that echoed the themes we had learned. They began volunteer work at the center in 2023, initially as part-time help scanning documents, then in 2024 joining a youth advisory panel. There they argued for youth-friendly explanations of records processes, insisting that forms be explained plainly and that clinics offer help in filling them out. Their involvement was not ideological so much as practical. Someone who had grown up with a personal history rendered visible by a photocopy wanted to make that visibility routine for others. Whether or not they become a parent, they said, they would treat the act of preserving a certified copy as an expression of care. The work of institutionalizing attention continued, imperfectly. In November 2023, a software upgrade intended to digitize birth records in 2 counties introduced a glitch that altered name fields for dozens of entries. Corrections required manual verification. The error was caught because a volunteer at the community center, using an old habit, cross-checked a newly digitized record against a printed photocopy that had been squirreled away in a file box. The mistake was corrected, but the episode underscored a tension we had always known. Digital systems can streamline access yet also reproduce gaps when human oversight is elided. The lesson was familiar. Checks and balances are as necessary in code as in counters. And it reinforced our advocacy for hybrid systems that acknowledge the value of both paper and pixel. By 2025, some of the earlier policy conversations had matured. The county's quarterly compliance reports, required since the 2022 resolution, revealed modest but meaningful gains. Increased documentation at discharge, fewer appeals filed for missing certified copies, and a rise in community workshops training parents in how to request records. A statewide working group convened in spring 2025 to explore scalable models. They invited representatives from our community center to testify about what small acts, laminated checklists, community archivists, youth advisors, had produced. That testimony was modest and ordinary but persuasive precisely because it mapped practical failures to practical remedies. The working group did not legislate a universal solution. Instead it recommended a framework of incentives and technical assistance for counties willing to adopt hybrid records practices. It was a policy of nudges, improvements rather than impositions, designed to make the offering of certified copies a routine, not an exceptional act. Across these years the ordinary domestic rituals persisted. Easter came and went. Sometimes there was a quiet way of setting an envelope aside and saying nothing. In other years the envelope was explicitly discussed, pulled out, opened, read. The silence at that first Easter never felt replicable in its exact form. Silence depends on time, on surprise, on the people present. Yet the memory of that silence functioned as a moral thermostat, calibrating how we spoke about origin, about belonging, about the obligations of families to one another and to the larger civic order. I cannot say that everything has been fixed. New problems arise as old ones are solved. Registries redesign their forms, leaving librarians and community workers to translate them for the elderly. IT upgrades introduce new privacy questions. Political leadership changes. But the accumulation of small, repeated acts, the checklists laminated behind hospital counters, the community workshops that teach parents how to ask, the youth advisors who insist on plain language, creates an architecture for care. That architecture is not robust by some abstract standard. It is instead a set of practices that, when performed, reduce the likelihood that a child's life will be interrupted by an administrative oversight. There is a modest humility to this work. It asks less for sweeping reform than for steadiness, for people to show up, to file, to copy, to record, to learn, to teach. Rosa's stories continue to be told around our tables. The photocopy remains in its sleeve in the community archive. Sometimes researchers ask to see it. Sometimes a nurse visiting the center will stand and talk about a patient whose life would have been different without that small piece of paper. My child continues to carry the slip, sometimes as talisman, sometimes forgotten in a wallet, sometimes pressed into the pages of a book. As the decade unfolds, I think often about inheritance, not of wealth nor of fame but of technique, how to leave behind not only rules but habits. I imagine a parent, decades hence, placing a certified copy into a packet and slipping a simple note inside, "This is to keep you safe." The gesture will likely feel, to that parent, small and domestic. But small gestures have ripple effects. The photocopy that once silenced an Easter table has become, unexpectedly, an instrument for teaching a larger civic patience, that institutions must be taught to be gentle, that paper can carry dignity when handled with care, and that family is both disclosed and embodied over time. The work is far from finished. Committees will reconfigure, software will update, new volunteers will forget and then remember, young people will take up the tasks we pass on and change how they are done. In that ongoingness there is hope, a modest, practical hope that habits can be transmitted and that ordinary acts of attention can become the scaffolding for a more humane public life. As I continue to file, to teach, to tell Rosa's stories, and to sit at kitchen tables with envelopes present or absent, the photocopy sits in its sleeve, no longer an accusation but an invitation, to attend, to certify, to keep each other legible for the institutions that both enable and ignore us, and to do so again tomorrow. In the years after Rosa's death, the small acts we had institutionalized began to accrete into a pattern that looked less like improvisation and more like policy. The things people had done out of embarrassment or shame or ordinary decency. Laminating checklists, offering forms in plain language, sitting at kitchen tables with envelopes, started to be described in municipal reports as promising practices. That language felt oddly bureaucratic when you had been standing in a doorway with someone's hand on your shoulder, but it mattered. Naming something organizes resources. In January 2026, the County Board published a follow-up to the 2022 resolution, a 50-page progress brief that recorded metrics alongside anecdotes. It enumerated the gains I had noticed, from a 28% increase in certified copies issued at discharge in 2023 to a 46% rise by mid-2025 in clinics that offered assisted filing. It also recorded failures, drop-offs in rural outreach, persistent confusion over name change procedures, and it set 2-year targets for improvement. Those targets were not abstract. In March 2026, the Community Center received a modest implementation grant from a regional foundation, explicitly tied to the county's plan. The grant paid for 2 full-time archivists and for stipends to youth advisors, including my child, who by then had turned 25, born in 2001, 19 in 2020, and who had layered the center with a practical impatience for clear procedures. The money also funded a monthly records clinic at the center, walk-in hours where parents could bring birth certificates, guardians could request certified copies, and seniors could have their documents explained in person. I attended a few of those clinics and watched the ritual of certification become a kind of domestic choreography, forms on the table, inked stamps, a gentle explanation about why a paper matters and how to keep it safe. In April 2026, a local reporter wrote a piece that quoted the archived photocopy as emblematic. An old photocopy, sleeved and annotated, she wrote, has made a precinct of the public imagination. The article looped the personal and the civic, the envelope at Easter, the photocopy in the archive, the new clinics offering help. Technological changes followed similar, measured patterns. After the 2023 software glitch, the county IT department had worked with the community center to design a hybrid system that prioritized human oversight. In June 2026, the county rolled out an update to its digitization protocols. Every record input would be verified against a paper scan if the original was older than 5 years. Any name field changed by automated parsing would flag a manual review. The policy included audit trails, time-stamped and accessible to a designated ombudsperson at the county clerk's office. These might read as dry sentences in a procedural manual, yet they represented a cultural shift. The system admitted fallibility and built-in humility. In a small ceremony at the county building that summer, the director of records thanked the volunteers who had cross-checked digitized files against saved photocopies. He said, plainly, that the county owed them an institutional debt. Those were words we had rarely heard spoken in the bureaucratic spaces where decisions are usually made. By 2027, the state took notice. The working group formed in 2025 published a policy brief in February 2027 synthesizing county experiments with hybrid models. The brief did not demand universal mandates, instead it recommended a set of incentives, technical assistance grants, model forms, training modules, so that counties could adopt practices that fit their populations. The brief circulated among state legislators and was discussed in committee hearings that spring, where community center representatives, including my child and the nurse who had sat at Rose's window, testified about the intimate consequences of paperwork. One member of the committee, a former social worker, read aloud the transcript of the Easter silence and asked the room to imagine a child's life interrupted by an oversight. Those hearings shifted the tone of debate. The issue stopped being a niche administrative problem and became a question of civic dignity. In August 2027, 3 counties, ours among them, applied to the state for the Model Assistance Grant. The application required an explicit plan for outreach to rural clinics and elder care facilities. It required commitments to youth training and to archiving oral histories alongside records. The state approved the grants in November 2027 and provided funds to hire outreach coordinators and to build a low-cost redundancy system, paper backups stored off-site, encrypted digital copies, and a publicly accessible, searchable index that did not reveal personal data but allowed authorized workers to confirm the existence of records and the need for certified copies. The system was modest. It did not solve everything. But it meant that when a midwife, a hospital clerk or a weary parent asked for help, there were now trained people to say yes and to show how. At the same time, a parallel conversation about privacy and consent unfolded. In 2028, national conferences on data protection raised questions about how to manage hybrid registries. Activists and technologists argued that making records more accessible could inadvertently expose vulnerable populations. The county responded by drafting privacy protocols that balanced transparency with safeguards. Limited access to identifying fields, third-party oversight of audits, and explicit consent forms when records were shared for legal or medical reasons. Those measures were adopted locally in March 2029 after a public comment period in which community members, including an elderly woman who had once had her name transcribed incorrectly, spoke about fear and necessity. The balance was uneasy but intentional. Access without privacy is harm. Privacy without access is invisibility. Legal questions surfaced as well. A few families in neighboring counties brought administrative appeals in 2028 and 2029 when clerks refused to issue certified copies without unnecessary proof. Those cases were small, prosaic, and decided in lower courts, often for lack of dramatic legal theory. Still, they mattered. In November 2029, a circuit court affirmed that counties must make reasonable efforts to provide certified copies at the point of discharge and that procedural burdens, imposing a waiting period, demanding distant notarized affidavits, could not be used to deny practical access. The decision did not create sweeping nationwide precedent, but within our region it reinforced the evolving standard. Certified copies are not a luxury, they are a basic enabling document for participation in civic and commercial life. The court's opinion quoted the county's 2026 progress brief and explicitly noted the role of community centers in making procedures humane. Meanwhile, domestic life and family rituals persisted, sometimes with irony and sometimes with softness. Easter still arrived as a tension between disclosure and discretion. In 2026, my child, who had taken to placing a fresh certified copy in a small envelope and putting it into a desktop safe, began a new ritual. Before visiting family on holidays, they would ring me and say, "Bring the envelope." On some years we opened it and talked about names. On others we left it sealed and ate rice and beans with the quiet that comes from having settled a matter. The memory of that first Easter, the one with the silence, remained a moral fulcrum. It taught us about the capacity of small objects to arrest a moment and demand a reckoning. It taught us that an ordinary household spotlights policy in ways official reports cannot. As the decade bent into the 2030s, the work matured further. In January 2030, the county launched a public awareness campaign centered on storytelling, short radio pieces, bus shelter posters, and a series of community theater nights that dramatized the bureaucratic missteps that had once cost people time, money, and sometimes their sense of belonging. The pieces used anonymized vignettes, scenes of a parent at a clinic, a young person traveling for work with a photocopied slip tucked in a passport. Each concluded with information about how to request certified copies and where to find help. The campaign was small in budget but consequential in tone. It normalized asking for help and acknowledged the shame that often accompanies bureaucratic failure. At the community center, the archive grew, methodically catalogued by date and circumstance. The photocopy in its sleeve remained the most famous item, cited in workshops and shown on request to students in nursing and social work programs. In October 2031, a university invited the center to collaborate on a longitudinal study of hybrid record systems. The study tracked outcomes, timeliness of record issuance, administrative appeals, and self-reported measures of belonging, across several counties over 5 years. Preliminary results, presented in 2032, suggested that counties adopting hybrid practices and investing in local outreach reduced the incidence of emergency situations tied to missing documentation by roughly a third. That was both encouraging and incomplete. Causation is messy, and improvements depended on committed people as much as on policies. Human stories continued to complicate data. In 2032, a woman brought her infant to the center because the hospital where the child was born had initially misfiled the name. The clerks needed to reissue a certified copy, but the hospital's internal records showed the correction only in a scanned PDF buried in a folder. Without the hybrid practice of cross-referencing paper and pixel, the mother might have left with nothing. The center's archivist, trained in the protocols we had developed since 2025, guided the mother through reissuance. The family walked out of the center with a certified copy in hand, and later, they left a small note in the archive, on paper, thanking the volunteers. Those notes accumulate in the ledger like small bequests. They are not monumental, but they map a human geography of care. The passage of time also altered how younger people understood inheritance. For my child's generation, born in the early years of the millennium, the presence of a certified copy in a pocket or a glove compartment is as likely to be a precaution as it is to be a talisman. When they became parents, some of them in the late 2020s, others in the early 2030s, they often included a certified copy in the welcome packet they assembled for their newborns, and they taught their children why keeping such copies matters. Those acts of transmission have a quiet magic. Children learn from pattern. By 2033, the Community Center's Youth Advisory Panel reported that among participants aged 18 to 25, 87% had at least one certified document safely stored, a statistic that would have been almost unimaginable in 2019. Yet challenges persisted. Economic insecurity continued to complicate the logistics of obtaining and storing documents. In 2031, a local pandemic of housing instability meant that some families kept document packets in storage units or gave them to friends for safekeeping. Retrieval was not always straightforward. The center experimented with secure, low-cost storage lockers and with digital scans encrypted and stored off-site, but no solution fit every need. Policy continues to be an exercise in triage. Resources must be allocated, and choices have consequences. The architecture we built, simple, human, iterative, helped more than it hurt, but it never promised perfection. There were also moral questions about the limits of bureaucratic fixes. In community meetings in 2032 and 2033, some participants asked whether reforming records practices so that everyone could reliably claim an identity would also level power imbalances in other domains: education, health, housing. They were right to ask. Paper alone cannot redress structural inequality. But we learned, in the slow accretion of small acts, that administrative dignity is a precondition for other kinds of justice. You cannot demand access to benefits if an algorithm or a clerk renders you unfindable. Through these ongoing debates, the story of Rosa remained a touchstone. In July 2033, the Community Center organized a Remembrance Day for those whose lives had been reshaped by records. those who had used a certified copy to pursue education, to register for healthcare, to avoid a deportation proceeding, and it included a short film about Rosa's life and the photocopy that had initiated the conversation. At the screening, my child spoke quietly about lineage, not genetic lineage only, but civic lineage, the idea that the habits you pass down are a form of social inheritance.